Hey, welcome to Consistency Please podcast edition. I thought I'd try a different format and see how it pans out. Lots of people on the political left are accusing capitalists and other anti-socialists, which is a term I'm going to use here, of contradicting themselves or being inconsistent by supporting emergency government relief during the coronavirus shutdown. But is this really inconsistent? Do anti-socialists need to choose between government assistance all the time for various purposes and no government assistance at all, even during emergencies and government-imposed lockdowns, on pain of inconsistency? Well, first, I want to make sure that we avoid purely verbal disputes in this discussion. Whether X, whatever X is, counts as socialism depends on what the proper definition of socialism turns out to be. This is an entirely semantic question, and semantic questions are rarely deep or consequential. Answering them just tells us how a term in English ought to be used. It can't settle substantive questions about ideological consistency. And moreover, these semantic questions are often just a pretext to use terms with negative connotations as epithets or insults, which tends to short-circuit critical reflection and discussion. So instead, I'm going to focus on two ideas or policies that are typically associated with the term socialism, or which are typically taken to fall under the rubric of socialism. First is the government ownership and or control of the means of production, pretty classical definition. But the second is the mandated redistribution of wealth, or taxation for goods that are made available to others for free, or at least at a discount. This second socialistic idea, as I'll call it, is what's at issue here. Now the question is this: if you oppose socialism, must you oppose the current redistributive proposals like payouts to families, temporary paid sick leave, loans to small businesses, free medical care related to the coronavirus, and so on? Well, I think the answer to this question depends crucially on the reason why a particular anti-socialist supports the government relief efforts. Socialists typically think that a wide array of social programs are justified, both in emergency and non-emergency situations, in virtue of the fact that people who are struggling through personal hardships or emergencies deserve help, and most importantly because others, especially the rich, may be legitimately forced to provide it. If a particular anti-socialist supports the relevant government assistance simply because the individuals who will receive it are going through personal hardships and emergencies as a result of the virus, it would seem to be the case that they should also support government aid for other temporary hardships and emergencies, such as unemployment, costly medical emergencies, and the like. Why would hardships imposed by a virus be more worthy of assistance than hardships imposed by some other medical problem, if the justification for providing aid is simply that people need it? And if we're spending this money to protect an especially vulnerable class of people from this threat, in this case the elderly and the immunocompromised, why shouldn't we be spending this money to protect them from other threats to which they are uniquely vulnerable? It does seem that supporting the emergency assistance for these sorts of reasons creates a consistency problem for anti-socialists, at least for anti-socialists who oppose needs or means-tested welfare programs. However, there are at least two other reasons why a particular anti-socialist might support the emergency government assistance in question, both of which seem fully consistent with an anti-socialist position. First, she might support the government aid because a pandemic is a threat to the country as a whole, as opposed to particular individuals. If the hospitals are flooded with COVID-19 patients, this will clog up access to healthcare, and not just for COVID-19 victims, which is an externality that constitutes a threat to us all. Moreover, a high enough death toll from the virus might be such a catastrophic trauma that it crashes the American economy, which would also be considerable harm to Americans as a whole. Anti-socialists are generally okay with government action that is aimed at protecting the country as a whole from threats, or aimed at protecting some individuals from bringing harm to other individuals, whether unintentionally or intentionally. Now obviously, a full-on anarchist who believes that all coercive government action, shutdowns, taxation, and the like, is unjustified cannot support the emergency aid. But for my purposes, I'm focusing on the more mainstream anti-socialist positions that allow for at least certain kinds of coercive government action. Second, the anti-socialists might support the government aid in question as just compensation for the economic consequences of a forced shutdown by the government. It is beyond dispute that both workers and businesses will be harmed by the forced closures of various businesses. This isn't to say that the shutdowns are unjustified, but it is to say that compensation seems to be owed as a matter of justice. Negative rights and freedoms are being suspended, and folks are plausibly owed compensation when this happens. This is quite different from justifying the government aid based purely on meeting human needs and alleviating individual suffering. It is to justify it as compensation for an imposed harm, rather than as help from a government that did not cause the harm. So, as I see it, there are at least two ways for an anti-socialist to support government aid during the coronavirus outbreak without contradicting her anti-socialist principles. First, she can view it as protecting the country as a whole from a systematic breakdown in healthcare access. Or she can view it as just compensation for the harms involved in a forced economic shutdown. Neither of these justifications commit her to endorsing government aid aimed at alleviating individual hardships and suffering during a pandemic or otherwise. Now, I haven't argued that the anti-socialist position is the correct political position. That hasn't been my goal here. I'm simply arguing that an anti-socialist can avoid the charge of inconsistency in her support of emergency government aid during a pandemic. But what do you think? Do you think capitalists are being inconsistent by supporting this aid? Or do you think that the two ways that I've carved out here are consistent ways to hold on to capitalism and support the aid? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you in the next podcast.